Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now proceed with the review of the United Arab Emirates. May I draw your attention to the reports on which the review is based, and in accordance with Resolution 5/1, the National Report, the compilation report as prepared by the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, and a summary of stakeholders' information. I now have the honor to give the floor to His Excellency Dr. Anwar Mohammed Gargash, Minister of State for Foreign Affairs of the United Arab Emirates, to introduce the report. Excellency, you have the floor.
On behalf of the United Arab Emirates, I am honored to return to Geneva to discuss the progress we have made in implementing the recommendations from our first universal periodic review in 2008. With my colleagues, I thank the countries that participated in the working group for our review and the Troika of Germany, Thailand, and Ethiopia. I would like to convey to all of you who are here today the warm greetings of the people of the United Arab Emirates. At the outset, let me express the UAE's appreciation for the review process and the opportunity it gives us to have this open dialogue with the international community. The UPR process represents a beacon for the cause of human rights worldwide. The dialogue we are having in Geneva today presents an unparalleled opportunity for us to promote a transparent and inclusive approach to human rights. It's an opportunity we fully embrace and value. Mr. President, it is my pleasure to introduce our delegation, which is comprised of several officials who have very ably supported the compilation of a report on human rights in the UAE. Our delegation also includes members from civil society groups who were involved in the preparation of this report. Since the 2008 UPR, the UAE government has made it a priority to put into practice the outcomes of the review. In 2010, we set up a committee specifically to support the objective of ensuring that we are following through on our commitments under the UPR. The committee is comprised of government bodies, both federal and local, and advisors from civil society organizations. It now acts as a permanent forum for the consultative process with civil society in the UAE. The committee developed a plan to implement the outcome of the review, working closely with a host of national actors. Feedback on a draft of the plan was sought from government ministries, civil society associations, and our National Assembly, the Federal National Council. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank our own civil society for their contribution to the review. Their participation was a centerpiece of our UPR process. In the course of consultations and engagement they had with the committee over the last 2 years, our citizens and civil society organizations have shared their views on human rights in the UAE. Much of this input is reflected in the report. Following our last consultative meeting with civil society, the draft report was put on the committee's website in order to enable all our citizens to participate in the discussion about advancing human rights in the UAE. The final national report was submitted to the Human Rights Council in October 2012, but our dialogue with civil society and other stakeholders in the UAE continues. Mr. President, this report demonstrates the efforts the UAE has made to implement the findings of the review and the continuous progress we are making. During the UAE's first review, many countries put forward questions regarding the UAE's human rights record. Recommendations were made covering a wide range of human rights issues, including the ratification of international human rights treaties, national implementation of human rights commitments, the rights of workers, and the rights of women and children. The UAE government accepted 36 recommendations and made 9 additional voluntary pledges. More than 90% of these were implemented. Details of the actions we took are in the report, which provides a specific response to each recommendation. In the course of this intervention, I would like to discuss a few thematic areas that these recommendations covered and review some of the significant progress that has occurred during the last 4 years. Mr. President, the UAE has a stable political system characterized by a consultative relationship between its citizens and its government, the application of the rule of law and good governance. This is underpinned by a constitution which guarantees the rights of UAE citizens. The UAE's political system has evolved over time in response to the needs of a modern nation state while staying consistent with its traditions. We take pride in our achievements, but we are never satisfied with the status quo. Let me be clear, we are facing challenges. I will not stand here in front of you and say that we have a spotless record in the UAE. Indeed, I am not aware of any country that does. In a difficult and unstable region and in a country with a rapidly growing population, a large percentage of whom are expatriates, our approach to human rights is inevitably an evolving one. What we do have is a strong commitment to improve the situation. I can assure you that the UAE government takes concerns of any possible violation of human rights very seriously, and that we are constantly working on strengthening our capacity to respond to these. We will continue to take this proactive approach in a way that is consistent with our Constitution, laws, and traditions to address or prevent situations which threaten or violate human rights. Mr. President, it is a central duty of any government to ensure that it has adequate legislation and institutions in place to ensure the rights of its people are protected. Since the first UPR, the UAE has comprehensively reviewed its constitution and laws in order to implement systems that effectively protect human rights. This process entailed undertaking significant reforms, details of which are in the report. Allow me, though, to highlight a few developments in this regard. The UAE Constitution was amended in 2009. Among other changes, the tenure of the Federal National Council members was extended to 4 years in order to allow its members to complete a comprehensive term of parliamentary work. This is in line with international parliamentary standards. The remit of the FNC has also now been expanded to include a role in debating international treaties and international conventions undertaken by the government. During recent years, the UAE has also implemented diverse legislative initiatives to address other human rights issues, including the enactment of several measures to strengthen the rights of workers and the amendment of legislation on the rights of people with disabilities. The UAE accepted 2 recommendations on protecting children's rights at the last review, and as a result, we are in the process of adopting a federal law concerning children's rights. The law includes a number of measures that are designed to protect children and prescribes penalties for breaching its provisions. More details related to the progress of human rights legislation in the UAE are set out in our report. The UAE also understands the importance of promoting institutional frameworks that aim to strengthen the protection of human rights. As our report shows, several departments and government entities concerned with human rights have been established at both federal and domestic levels during the past few years. A group of recommendations that we received during the first review, as well as questions submitted in advance of this session by the Netherlands and the United Kingdom, concerned the establishment of a national human rights institution in the UAE. We remain committed to taking this recommendation forward and have taken a series of important steps in order to realize it. Mr. President, a number of recommendations in 2008 called on the UAE government to do more to ratify treaties and other international instruments. We appreciate that our engagement with the international community in the field of human rights must be multifaceted, including studying the accession to international conventions, cooperating with treaty bodies and special procedures, undertaking the UPR, and cooperating with the activities of the Human Rights Council. On each of these levels, the UAE has done much to comply with internationally accepted standards. The UAE has acceded to various international conventions, including the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on Rights of Children, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, whose optional protocol we signed in 2010, and the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, and the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. The UAE also recently joined the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment, formally acceding to the Convention last July. We will also continue the process of joining the optional protocols on child involvement in armed conflicts and the optional protocol on child exploitation and pornography. We continue to review and actively consider ratification of other international human rights instruments. Acknowledging the vital role that this cooperation plays in
I thank His Excellency for the statement and for his presence with us this afternoon. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, before giving the floor to delegations for their questions and comments, I would like to remind you to respect the established speaking time of 1 minute and 23 seconds. 1 minute and 23 seconds, in order to accommodate all inscribed speakers. Now, I will give the floor to first speaker on my list, distinguished representative of Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Armenia thanks the delegation of the United Arab Emirates for their national report and the presentation today by His Excellency Mohammed Gargash. We commend all efforts for strengthening the cooperation between the United Arab Emirates and international human rights mechanisms. Particularly, we took note of the visit of High Commissioner of Human Rights and of Special Rapporteurs on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and the positive approach of your country. Armenia supports the government of United Arab Emirates in its strong commitment to the education and capacity building among the population. We appreciate all steps to insert human rights concept into the program of compulsory education and all other governmental initiatives. We acknowledge the progress made for the promotion of rights of women, such as the establishment of the national strategy for the advancement and empowerment of women and for the standardization of national framework with international treaties such as Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Millennium Development Goals. Armenia recommends to United Arab Emirates to consider ratifying the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and second, to consider adoption of specific legislation on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Thank you.
Je vous remercie. Je passe la parole au distingué représentant de la Belgique.
Monsieur le Président, la Belgique salue les efforts déployés par les Émirats arabes unis pour donner suite aux recommandations du premier EPU. Elle encourage la poursuite de ces efforts afin de tenir compte de certains développements récents relatifs aux droits de l'homme dans ce pays. Mon pays s'inquiète particulièrement des restrictions à la liberté d'expression et à la liberté d'association. Dans ce contexte, la Belgique recommande aux Émirats arabes unis de 1. Mettre la législation pénale, notamment les articles 8 et 176 du Code pénal, en concordance avec les standards internationaux qui régissent la liberté d'expression. 2. Respecter le droit à la liberté d'expression et d'association et de restreindre au strict nécessaire l'usage de poursuites pénales contre les personnes qui font usage de ces droits. 3. Coopérer avec les procédures spéciales et accéder aux demandes en cours des rapporteurs spéciaux de pouvoir visiter ce pays. Concernant la peine de mort, la Belgique plaide pour son abolition. Ceci étant, tant que les Émirats arabes unis maintiendront la peine de mort, la Belgique souhaiterait formuler les recommandations suivantes. 1. Respecter les standards minimaux à ce sujet. 2. Appliquer la peine de mort en conformité avec l'article 37 de la Convention des droits de l'enfant à laquelle les Émirats arabes unis sont partis. Je vous remercie.
Merci. Je passe Parole au distingué représentant de Tunisie. Excellence, je vous en prie.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي بوفد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة الذي يقوده السيد أنور قرقاش وزير الدولة للشؤون الخارجية، ويثمن عاليا الأهمية التي يوليها هذا البلد الشقيق إلى آلية الاستعراض الدوري الشامل، وأخص بالذكر جهود السفير عبيد الزعايبي. وتأخذ تونس علما بالإجراءات التي اتخذتها دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة منذ الدورة الأولى للاستعراض الدوري الشامل سنة 2008، وخاصة التعديل الدستوري لسنة 2009، وإحداث عديد اللجان والهياكل المعنية بحقوق الإنسان، والمصادقة على اتفاقيتي حقوق المعاقين ومناهضة التعذيب. وتوصي تونس بالتعجيل في استكمال الإجراءات المصادقة على البروتوكولين الإضافيين لاتفاقية حقوق الطفل، ودراسة إمكانية سحب بعض التحفظات على هذه الاتفاقية. كما توصي تونس بالإسراع بإتمام الدراسات المتعلقة بإنشاء مؤسسة وطنية لحقوق الإنسان وفق مبادئ باريس، وبدراسة إمكانية التصديق على بروتوكول إضافي لاتفاقية مناهضة التعذيب. وتلاحظ تونس بارتياح الجهود التي تبذلها دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان وحمايتها، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بتحقيق المساواة بين الجنسين وبنشر ثقافة حقوق الإنسان وتحسين ظروف العيش المواطنين وإقامة الأجانب. وتشجع تونس على مواصلة الجهود في هذه المجالات ومن أجل تعزيز الإطار القانوني لحقوق الإنسان من خلال النظر في المصادقة على الاتفاقيات الرئيسية الأخرى، وخاصة العهدين الدوليين لحقوق المدنية والسياسية والحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية وقانون روما الأساسي. وتنفيذا لقرار مجلس حقوق الإنسان رقم 38/19، توصي تونس دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة بالعمل على مواصلة جهودها قصد الاستجابة لطلبات استعادة الأموال المنهوبة إلى أصحابها، والتعاون لتسليم المورطين في انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان وقضايا الفساد. وشكرا.
Mr. President, Austria welcomes His Excellency the Minister of State and his delegation to the UPR and thanks them for their report. We note with appreciation the ratification of CAT following the first round of UPR. However, echoing concerns expressed by the High Commissioner, we call on the government to fully ensure the protection, rights to freedom of expression and freedom of association and assembly of human rights defenders and political activists. Could the government explain which steps it is taking to better protect religious minorities and to ensure freedom of religion and belief? His Excellency the Minister mentioned new protective legislation ensuring legal rights, minimum wage, housing and social standards for domestic labourers. Is there a concrete time frame for enactment of this law, and what measures are envisaged to ensure a speedy implementation? Austria offers the following recommendations to the government of the UAE. 1. Ratify the ICCPR, the Rome Statute of the ICC, opt-cut and withdraw your reservations to CAT. 2. Ensure the full protection of the rights of freedom of expression, association, assembly, religion and belief by all UAE residents. 3. Take steps to protect human rights defenders, journalists and religious minorities from discrimination, harassment or intimidation, including the arbitrary deprivation of nationality. 4. Enshrine full equality between women and men in the Constitution and enact specific legislation to protect women, including domestic migrant workers, from sexual and domestic violence. 5. Abolish the death penalty and ensure that fair trial guarantees are properly implemented. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President. In 2008, the UAE voluntarily pledged to study the establishment of an independent national human rights institution. We welcome the recent approval by the UAE Federal National Council of the creation of a permanent human rights committee. Could the delegation of the UAE inform us on the composition, mandate, and oversight of this human rights committee, as well as the remaining steps and deadlines for its establishment? Canada recommends that the UAE, 1. Continue to strengthen labor laws by implementing the provisions of the June 2011 ILO treaty that extends key labor protection to domestic workers. 2. Continue to introduce amendments to its national family law to ensure equal status and rights for women in all matters. 3. Continue to take steps to uphold freedom of expression by reviewing restrictive articles of its recent cybercrime law and consider updating the 1980 media law. We recommend that the new legislation be aligned with Article 19 of the ICCPR. We welcome the steps taken by the UAE to introduce legislations, policies and memorandums to ensure migrant workers' rights, as well as improve their working and living conditions. Canada also recognizes the important work done by the UAE to empower women and promote values of equality, including the 2012 decree allowing Emirati women married to foreigners to pass the citizenship to their children once they are of legal age. Canada commends the UAE on measures taken to improve and promote human rights. Canada would also like to highlight the work done by the UAE to respect international refugee protection standards despite the absence of a national framework regulating asylum. Thank you.
d'Éthiopie.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ethiopia welcomes the delegation of United Arab Emirates, led by His Excellency Dr. Anwar Mohammed Gargash, Ministry of State for Foreign Affairs. We note with appreciation the progress made by the government of United Arab Emirates in achieving high living standards in the country. We welcome the national plan of the government of the United Arab Emirates to implement the recommendations of the Human Rights Council during its first UPR session. Noting the positive efforts of the government of the United Arab Emirates, my delegation would like to seek clarification on the measures taken by the government of the United Arab Emirates to further protection migrant workers' rights. My delegation would also like to encourage the government of the United Arab Emirates to continue on its active and fruitful engagement with the countries of origin of migrant workers. Finally, my delegation would like to recommend to the United Arab Emirates to continue on its efforts to provide more protection to domestic workers and improve their living conditions.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلادي بالوفد الموقر لدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة برئاسة معالي الدكتور أنور محمد قرقاش وزير الدولة للشؤون الخارجية، ويغتنم الفرصة ليحيي جهود واقتدار بعثة الإمارات في جنيف برئاسة سعادة السفير عبيد الزعابي وطاقم البعثة، ولا سيما نشاطهم الفاعل في إطار مجلس حقوق الإنسان. اطلع وفد بلادي باهتمام على التقرير الوطني الذي أعدته الإمارات ضمن الجولة الثانية من آلية الاستعراض الدوري الشامل، ولا يسعه إلا أن يرحب بالخطوات الملموسة المحرزة في اتجاه تطبيق التوصيات التي كانت قد تلقتها خلال الجولة الأولى للاستعراض عام 2008. السيد الرئيس، يود وفد بلادي أن يستفسر من وفد الإمارات عن التقدم الذي أحرزته الدولة في مجال تمكين المرأة ومشاركتها السياسية. من جهة ثانية، يود وفد بلادي أن يوصي بالاستمرار في بذل الجهود نحو تحقيق نظام يكفل قدرا أفضل من الحماية للأطفال، كما وتعزيز وتطوير حقوق المرأة وحمايتها. وشكرا.
Représentant d'Australie.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Australia welcomes the delegation of the United Arab Emirates to the Human Rights Council. Australia welcomes the United Arab Emirates' accession to the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. We also commend its invitation to the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, whose visit to the UAE took place in 2012. We welcome efforts since 2008 to eliminate gender-based discrimination, including citizenship rights for all children of UAE women, and recommend that the United Arab Emirates implement further measures to support victims of domestic violence. We encourage the United Arab Emirates to take further measures to strengthen its human rights framework, including in relation to freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and due process. In this regard, we recommend that the UAE accede to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and its optional protocols, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and adopt measures to promote awareness of the rights contained in these instruments. Consistent with Australia's universal opposition to the death penalty, we recommend that the UAE establish a moratorium on the death penalty as a first step towards complete abolition of this practice and accession to the second optional protocol of the ICCPR. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I have listened with interest and attention to the various comments and I thank you very much for this interactive side of the debate, which I think is very helpful. And I think that I have categorized many of the comments under certain items here. First of all, I would like to address something mentioned by His Excellency the representative of Austria regarding tolerance, religious tolerance. And I think this is one of our big success stories in the United Arab Emirates, our ability to marry our Muslim tradition with the presence of various communities, and to guarantee that religious practices are part and parcel of the fabric of everyday life. There are about 64 churches in the United Arab Emirates of all denominations, as well as Hindu temples, as well as Sikh temples, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, one of our more important goals in trying to build an open and progressive society. Furthermore, I think that in a very difficult period in Arab history, we have walked a fine line between the requirements for national security and between the requirements for an open society that allows expression. This has not always been difficult, but I think that we have walked it rather successfully in a very difficult and turbulent region. Various, of course, things have been thrown at us, and many of these things are groundless, and I also urge some of the speakers to actually seek further information on our side to clarify these important elements. On the issue of women, which has also been repeated, again I urge you that to understand that we have one of the most progressive and successful records on women in the region and of any Muslim and Arab society. This has allowed us to enable women in the workplace legally and so on and so forth. So I urge also a better understanding of a very successful record on enablement of women in the United Arab Emirates tradition or experience. I would like, there has been, and I think understandably, various questions about labor. This continues to be work in progress. We will always work on improving here. We've worked very hard. I would like to refer to Mr. Maher Al-Ubad from the Ministry of Labor to speak very briefly for 2 minutes on some of the items that we have undertaken to improve labor conditions, which continues to be work in progress. Maher.
سيدي، من خلال الأسئلة والمداخلات أود أن أشير إلى 3 نقاط. لقد تكلمت صاحب المعالي عن موضوع ظروف العمل، وتمت الإشارة إلى التطور الكبير الذي حدث في مسألة ظروف العمل. النقاط الثلاث التي أحب أن أشير إليها هي أول في بداية مسألة حماية الأجور، ونحن نرى أن الأجر هو خط أحمر، وذلك لما يترتب على عدم دفع الأجر من تداعيات. بالنسبة لدولة الإمارات قامت بإنشاء مكتب لحماية الأجور في سنة 2008، وكان من أهم اختصاصاته والمهام التي وكلت له اللي هو وضع وتنفيذ نظام متكامل لمراقبة حماية الأجور وساعات العمل. وكان ناتج هذا المكتب اللي هو نظام حماية الأجور، وأتصور نحن من أولى الدول التي ابتدعت هذا النظام، والذي من خلاله نستطيع أن نقوم بشكل دائم من الاطلاع على عمليات صرف الأجور والتأكد من أن الصرف تم بما هو متفق عليه في العقود، وكذلك إذا توجد هناك بعض الاستقطاعات الغير قانونية. حاليا ومن خلال هذا النظام نستطيع أن نتأكد من صرف أكثر من 3,500,000 عامل يعملون في 235,000 منشأة مسجلة في وزارة العمل. أيضا من خلال هذا النظام استطعنا أن نحيل 377 منشأة إلى القضاء ثبت تأخير سداد أجور عمالها أكثر من شهرين، مع إعطاء الحق للعمال بالانتقال إلى منشأة أخرى. النقطة الثانية التي أحب أن أشير إليها اللي هي موضوع وقد تم الإشارة إليها أيضا في كلمة معالي الوزير، اللي هو التنقل داخل سوق العمل. وبالفعل من خلال من 2010 أصدر القرار صاحب المعالي وزير العمل، وكان هذا القرار هو يضع ضوابط والشروط لمنح تصاريح العمل الجديدة. والقرار هذا يستطيع من خلاله أي عامل وأيا كان مستواه المهاري بالانتقال بعد انتهاء مدة العقد. وأيضا إذا كان في أي إخلال من صاحب العمل فإن القانون يسمح له بالانتقال وبدون الرجوع إلى صاحب العمل، وأيضا بدون التقيد بشرط المدة. النقطة الأخيرة التي أحب أن ألفت النظر إليها اللي هو تحضر تشريعات الدولة وعلى رأسه دستور الدولة، وهو المعمول به في القضاء، باعتبار أن الجواز حق شخصي لا يجوز حجزه إلا بحكم قضائي. وقد أصدر سمو الشيخ سيف بن زايد آل نهيان نائب رئيس مجلس الوزراء وزير الداخلية تعميما بعدم حجز جواز السفر لأي شخص إلا بموجب حكم قضائي. وفي حالة سلم العامل جواز سفر طواعية لسبب ما فيحق له المطالبة باستعادته في أي وقت يشاء، وتكون المطالبة إذا تعثر صاحب العمل عن طريق وزارة العمل أو وزارة الداخلية، والتي تقوم بالتعاون مع إدارة حقوق الإنسان والجهات المختصة باسترجاع جواز سفر وتسليم العامل. شكرا.